Hi, it's Roger here with a short video on how this crisis was predicted 250 years ago. This is an article here on the crisis. We're not talking about the health crisis or the political crisis here. We're talking about the economic crisis, which is already in this big bubble that's about to burst. And this article from MarketWatch says the stock market strength tells us less about the true state of the economy than almost any other time over the last 5 decades. That's half a century. The stock market economy disconnect you can see in this graph here. We are talking about this massive increase in money supply that the central banks have dumped into the economy with the intention of kickstarting the economy. And instead what's happened is it's gone into asset prices. The rich have got richer while those who need the money aren't getting it. So who is it that predicted this would happen? And what was their advice as to what we should do about it? The person is this economist, Richard Cantillon, who came out with this book, an essay on economic theory. And you're going to hear that this book actually was published 20 years after he was murdered. And we're going to see exactly why that happened, largely because of what he did about this. And you can see in this article here, Richard Cantillon, the most important economist you probably never heard of. And what he came up with is what is now called the Cantillon Effect. So let's have a quick look at this and see what he said. In 1734, Cantillon was mysteriously murdered and his house was set ablaze. And then this essay came out 20 years later. Cantillon's work went on to influence Adam Smith and other well-known economists. It goes on to say that what he came up with was the basis for everything from production, consumption, money and interest, international trade, business cycles, and inflation. And it was the observation that when money is created in an economy, it does not hit all areas at the same time. In fact, he actually has this quote here where he says, "I conclude that by doubling the quantity of money in a state, the prices of products and merchandise are not always doubled. The river, which runs and winds about in its bed, will not flow with double the speed when the amount of water is doubled. In a central bank economy, the entry point of money is via the central banks, and then it's the bureaucrats, the bankers, and other members of the state that are the first to enjoy this money, and it takes time, if ever, that it actually then moves on to the rest of the economy." So what is it you can do in such a situation? Well, there's 3 different things you can do. Richard Cantillon did the first one, which is actually what ended up getting him apparently murdered. And that is that he said, if you can't beat them, join them. Here is the story of the Mississippi bubble, one of the very first bubbles that popped in our modern society. It happened in 1720. And the story goes that there is a Scottish economist, John Law, who was able to persuade the French government that printing money was a great idea. And so they gave him effectively a virtual monopoly on printing money through something called Banque Generale, which still exists today. And he also was able to set up the Mississippi Company, which was owning all of the land that the French were taking over in America. So as a result of this, over about 20 years, he was raising all this money for the Mississippi Company. He was printing the money, and then he was having this massive bubble of value being generated until it was ready to crash. The person who was actually funding a lot of the people that were putting the money in was none other than Richard Cantillon. And he was actually funding it with his own high interest debt in such a way that even when the bubble was bursting, which he knew was going to happen, when that took place, he was still there collecting back on that debt. He ended up with so many enemies because he was already saying before this happened quite openly that this was going to be a burst bubble, that they ended up becoming so angry with him that one of them ended up murdering him, or so the story goes. But then there's another story, which is that in another biography, he actually staged his own death so that he could escape with his own riches. Whichever way it goes is not a great story, and it's not the route I would recommend for you. So what is option number 2? Well, option number 2 is that you become an entrepreneur. In fact, it was Richard Cantillon, it was the very first economist to even talk about what it is to be an entrepreneur. He saw that all workers were either non-fixed income or fixed income. The non-fixed income were the ones looking for wherever there were gaps in the market, and they were the ones that would actually stabilize the market. In fact, this is the very first definition of an entrepreneur, which is the one that Cantillon actually gave. He says, an entrepreneur is an adventurer who invests in the purchase of goods and materials with the incentive of selling these in the future. So we are at a time right now where we cannot just wait for the macroeconomics to catch up with us we can actually start focusing at our own microeconomics. And there are more opportunities now than ever for us to actually go out there and solve the problems that are necessary and create our own cash flow without waiting for the cash flow from the government. And so what is option number 3? Option number 3 is where we ourselves get to print our own money. You've all seen the run up in cryptocurrencies that's taking place at the moment. This is as a result of people losing more and more trust in the fiat systems that exist. And there are more and more opportunities for us to actually create our own means of exchange. And there's no question that this is going to grow in the coming years as we see this bubble start to pop as well. As an example, with Genius Group, which is my company, we are not just educating those who want to be entrepreneurs. We have a credit system which is turning into its own digital currency where you're getting credits for the education, and then you can then use those within our own community as well. Whichever of these 3 different options you choose to take, the most important thing is to know that this is not something new that's taking place in the world today, even though a lot of media articles will be scratching their heads asking why this is taking place right now. Richard Cantillon, he talked about this 250 years ago. As the saying goes, in history, nothing repeats itself, but everything rhymes. And with that, I want to say, I hope you have enjoyed this little video. If you have, please give it a like. Please subscribe if you want to hear about more coming. We have a big video that's going to be released next week, which is all about how to prepare for the coming crisis. So look forward to seeing you on that. And until then, have a wonderful few days ahead, and we'll catch up with you again very shortly.